The response came within an hour. His message was perfectly crafted, grateful but not desperate, professional yet personal. He thanked me for reaching out and mentioned how he'd been following my career trajectory within the company. That should have been my first red flag, but instead, I felt flattered. He spoke about how my posts about workplace leadership and team building had inspired him to pursue similar values. His resume was impressive, solid experience, good education and references that checked out when I called them. What struck me most was his apparent dedication to loyalty and teamwork, qualities that seemed rare in today's corporate environment. I spent my lunch break that day at the local subway, reading through his application materials and mentally preparing my pitch to management. The more I read, the more convinced I became that he would be a perfect fit for our team. I could already envision him working alongside me, bringing fresh perspectives while respecting the foundation of trust and mutual support that I'd worked so hard to build. The enthusiasm in his messages was infectious, and I found myself genuinely excited about the possibility of mentoring someone who seemed to share my professional values. That evening, I drove to the FedEx office on Maple Street to print out his resume on high-quality paper. As I watched the printer work, I felt a sense of pride in what I was about to do. Here was someone who needed an opportunity, and I was in a position to provide it. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I carefully organized his documents, adding my own handwritten note to the hiring manager about his potential. I stayed up until midnight that night, crafting the perfect email recommendation. Every word was chosen carefully, highlighting not just his qualifications but his character. I wrote about his dedication to teamwork, his respect for hierarchy, and his genuine desire to contribute to something bigger than himself. I painted a picture of someone who would be grateful for the opportunity and would never forget who gave him his chance. Little did I know that I was essentially writing my own professional obituary. But there was something else brewing beneath the surface that I couldn't quite put my finger on yet. Something that would soon reveal itself in ways I never expected. The next morning, I hand-delivered the recommendation to our HR department. Sarah, our HR coordinator, was sorting through mail behind the front desk when I walked in. The office smelled like fresh coffee, and that particular scent of new carpet that had been installed the week before. I placed the folder on her desk with a confidence that now seems almost naive. She looked up at me with a smile and said she'd review it by the end of the day. As I walked back to my cubicle, I felt like I was walking on air. There's something profoundly satisfying about using your influence to help someone else, about being the bridge between someone's potential and their opportunity. I spent the rest of the morning with an unusual spring in my step, imagining how grateful he would be, how our working relationship would develop, and how I might finally have someone on the team who truly understood the value of loyalty and hard work. I even started planning how I would introduce him to the rest of the team, the projects I might assign him, and the wisdom I could share from my years of experience. The call came that afternoon while I was filling up my car at the Shell station on 4th Street. He was ecstatic, almost shouting with joy through the phone. He'd gotten the interview, scheduled for the following Tuesday. As I stood there pumping gas, listening to his gratitude pour through the speaker, I felt a warmth that went beyond professional satisfaction. This was about human connection, about paying forward the kindness that others had shown me throughout my career. He kept saying how he would never forget what I'd done for him, how he hoped to learn everything I could teach him, and how he wanted to be the kind of colleague who would make me proud. His words were like music to my ears, confirming everything I'd believed about his character from our initial interactions. The autumn wind was picking up, rustling the leaves around the gas station, and I remember thinking how this moment felt like the beginning of something beautiful. I promised to call him that evening to help him prepare for the interview, to share insights about the company culture and what the hiring manager would be looking for. That night, we spent over 2 hours on the phone. I was sitting in my kitchen, nursing a cup of chamomile tea, while he took notes on the other end. I told him everything: the company's unwritten rules, the politics to avoid, the projects that would showcase his abilities, and even the personal quirks of the people he'd be working with. I shared stories about my own mistakes and victories, painting a detailed picture of what success looked like in our organization. His questions were thoughtful and showed genuine interest in not just getting the job, but in understanding how to excel once he got there. I found myself talking about the importance of patience, of building trust slowly, and of always being the person others could count on. He listened intently, occasionally making comments that showed he understood the deeper principles behind my advice. By the time we hung up, I felt like I'd just finished mentoring a younger version of myself. The confidence in his voice, the gratitude in his words, and the respect he showed for my experience all seemed to confirm that I'd made the right choice in recommending him. The morning of his interview, I arrived at the office early and positioned myself where I could see the parking lot. I wanted to catch him when he arrived, to offer some last-minute encouragement and maybe walk him to the HR office. The September sun was just beginning to warm the asphalt when I saw him pull up in a modest sedan. He was dressed impeccably, navy suit, crisp white shirt, and a tie that conveyed seriousness without being flashy. As he walked toward the building, I noticed how he carried himself with a quiet confidence that immediately impressed me. When he spotted me through the glass doors, his face lit up with genuine appreciation. We talked for a few minutes in the lobby, and I could see that he'd internalized everything we'd discussed. He spoke about his excitement to potentially join our team, about the values he hoped to bring to the role, and about his commitment to earning the trust I'd already placed in him. As I watched him walk toward the elevator for his interview, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just about helping someone get a job. It was about adding someone to our team who would strengthen the bonds of loyalty and mutual respect that made our workplace special. But even in that moment of pride, there was something in his parting glance that I should have paid more attention to, something that would soon reveal its true nature. 3 days after he started, I was organizing files in my cubicle when I heard my name mentioned from the conference room down the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and voices carried easily through the thin office walls. It was our director, Mr. Peterson, speaking in that casual tone he used when he thought no one important was listening. At first, I didn't pay much attention. My name came up in meetings regularly, since I handled most of the project coordination. But then I had something that made my blood run cold. "She's good at what she does, but honestly, she's easily replaceable," Peterson was saying. "We need someone who thinks more strategically, someone who can see the bigger picture." The words hit me like a physical blow. After 7 years of dedication, countless overtime hours, and consistently exceeding expectations, this was how my contributions were being characterized. But what happened next was even worse. I heard laughter. Not just any laughter, but the familiar sound of someone I'd just helped, someone I'd trusted, someone I'd opened doors for. The betrayal wasn't just in the words being spoken about me. It was in the enthusiastic agreement of the person I'd mentored. I stood frozen in my cubicle, my hands trembling as I held a stack of reports that suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The conversation continued, but now I was straining to hear every word. "You're absolutely right," came his voice, clear and confident. "I've been observing the team dynamics, and I think there's definitely room for improvement in terms of strategic thinking." The casualness with which he dismissed my worth was breathtaking. This was the same person who had called me his mentor just days before, who had thanked me repeatedly for believing in him when no one else would. Now he was actively participating in undermining my position, contributing to a narrative that painted me as dispensable. The fluorescent lights above seemed to flicker as I processed what I was hearing. I thought about all the late nights I'd spent training him, all the insider knowledge I'd shared, all the relationships I'd helped him build. Every piece of guidance I'd given him was now being used as ammunition against me. The realization hit me like a wave. I hadn't just recommended someone for a job. I'd actively recruited my own replacement. That afternoon, I couldn't concentrate on anything. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, analyzing every word, every tone, every implication. During my lunch break, I drove to the small park near the office and sat on a bench, staring at the empty playground equipment. The autumn leaves were falling steadily, covering the ground in a carpet of brown and gold that seemed to mirror the decay I was feeling inside. I tried to rationalize what I'd heard, to find alternative explanations, but the evidence was too clear. The person I'd vouched for, the person I'd put my reputation on the line for, was actively working to position himself as my superior. What made it worse was how skillfully he was doing it. He wasn't being obvious or crude. He was being strategic, agreeing with management's assessment, while subtly reinforcing their perception of my limitations. I realized that everything I'd taught him about office politics, about building relationships, about understanding the unspoken rules of corporate hierarchy, was being turned against me. The student had become the master, and I was the lesson being taught. The next morning I decided to test my suspicions. I arrived at the office early, and made my way to the break room, where I knew he usually grabbed his first cup of coffee. The smell of fresh brew filled the small space as I pretended to busy myself with organizing the sugar packets and stirring sticks. When he walked in, I greeted him with the same warmth I'd always shown, asking how his first week was going. His response was telling, polite but distant, professional but cold. Gone was the enthusiasm, the gratitude, the eagerness to learn that had characterized our previous interactions. Instead, he spoke about getting up to speed and identifying areas for improvement in a way that sounded rehearsed. When I mentioned a project I'd been working on, he casually suggested that maybe it was time for fresh eyes to take a look at it. The dismissal was subtle but unmistakable. As he walked away, coffee cup in hand, I noticed that he didn't even thank me for the sugar I'd handed him. It was a small thing, but it spoke volumes about how completely our dynamic had shifted. The person who had once hung on my every word now barely acknowledged my existence. The pattern became clearer over the following days. In team meetings, he would nod thoughtfully when I spoke, then follow up with comments that subtly undermined my points. He had a way of agreeing with me in principle, while suggesting that my approach was outdated or incomplete. "That's a good foundation," he would say, "but we might want to consider a more comprehensive strategy." The words were diplomatic, but the message was clear. I was the old guard, and he was the future. What frustrated me most was how effectively he was positioning himself. He wasn't attacking me directly. He was simply offering himself as a better alternative. In conversations with colleagues, he would reference industry trends and best practices that I wasn't familiar with, subtly establishing himself as more knowledgeable and forward-thinking. The confidence with which he spoke about subjects I'd never heard him mention before was remarkable. It was as if he'd been studying not just how to do the job, but how to do it better than the person who'd gotten him there. By the end of his second week, the shift in office dynamics was undeniable. Colleagues who had previously come to me with questions were now approaching him instead, not because he'd proven himself more capable, but because he'd successfully created the impression that he was the future of our department. I watched from my desk as he held court in the break room, sharing ideas and insights with an authority that seemed to come from nowhere. The transformation was so complete that I began to question my own memory of our earlier interactions. Had I imagined his gratitude? Had I misunderstood his respect for my experience? The person standing confidently in front of our colleagues bore little resemblance to the desperate job seeker I'd helped just 2 weeks earlier. It was like watching someone shed their skin, revealing a completely different creature underneath. The most painful part was realizing that every vulnerability he'd shown me, every expression of gratitude, every moment of apparent humility had been calculated to gain my trust and access to my position. The final confirmation came during our monthly team lunch at Romano's, a small Italian restaurant where we'd been gathering for years. I was sitting at one end of the table, picking at my Caesar salad, when I overheard him talking to Peterson about streamlining processes and eliminating redundancies. The conversation was happening right in front of me, but they spoke as if I wasn't there. When Peterson asked for specific examples, he began describing inefficiencies in systems I'd developed, pointing out ways they could be improved or replaced entirely. The clinical precision with which he dissected my work was impressive and terrifying. He'd obviously been studying every aspect of my job, not to learn from me, but to learn how to do it without me. As I sat there, surrounded by colleagues who had once valued my contributions, I felt completely invisible. The person I'd helped, the person I'd trusted, the person I'd opened doors for, was systematically closing those same doors behind me. But this was only the beginning of a deeper betrayal that would unfold in ways I couldn't yet imagine. The transformation in his voice was gradual but unmistakable. What had once been warm and respectful had turned cold and authoritative. The first time I really noticed it was during a routine project meeting in Conference Room B, a cramped space that smelled perpetually of stale coffee and dry erase markers. I was explaining the timeline for a client presentation when he interrupted me mid-sentence. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying a new edge I'd never heard before, "I think we need to reconsider that approach entirely." The tone wasn't just disagreement, it was dismissal. The way he said, "actually," felt like a verbal slap, a signal that my ideas were not just wrong, but irrelevant. I looked around the table and saw my colleagues' faces, noting how they seemed to accept this new dynamic without question. The person who had once asked permission to speak was now commanding the room, and I was the one being told to reconsider. The shift was so complete that I wondered if I'd imagined the deferent, grateful person I'd helped just a month earlier. This new version of him spoke with the confidence of someone who had always belonged in positions of authority, not someone who had begged for an opportunity. 3 weeks later, he walked into my cubicle while I was reviewing quarterly reports. The fluorescent light above my desk was flickering, casting intermittent shadows across the papers I'd spread out. Without any preamble, he leaned against my desk and said, "This project isn't really your priority anymore." The casualness of his statement was more shocking than if he'd shouted. He wasn't asking or suggesting, he was informing me. The project he was referring to was something I'd been developing for 6 months. A comprehensive analysis of our client retention strategies that was supposed to be my contribution to the annual review. Now, with 4 words, he was removing me from my own work. When I asked what he meant, he shrugged and said that Peterson had decided the project needed a different perspective. The way he said it made it clear that he was that different perspective. I felt my face flush with anger and embarrassment, but I managed to keep my voice steady as I asked if Peterson had specifically requested this change. His smile was thin and cold as he replied, "We discussed it." The use of "we" was particularly cutting. It established a relationship between him and our boss that explicitly excluded me. The exclusion from meetings began shortly after that conversation. I first noticed it on a Tuesday when I arrived at the office to find several of my colleagues already gathered in the conference room, discussing a project I'd been working on. The blinds were drawn, but I could see their silhouettes through the glass, and I could hear the muffled sound of his voice leading the discussion. When I knocked on the door, the conversation stopped abruptly. Sarah from HR opened it with an apologetic smile and said, "Oh, we're just having a quick brainstorming session." Nothing formal. But the formal agenda on the whiteboard and the detailed notes scattered across the table told a different story. He looked at me from across the room with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not hostile, but not friendly either. It was the look of someone who had moved beyond me, who no longer saw me as relevant to the conversation. As I walked back to my desk, I could hear the discussion resume, his voice once again taking the lead. The message was clear. Decisions about my own work were being made without my input, and my presence was no longer required or desired. The most humiliating incident occurred during our quarterly presentation to the regional managers. I had prepared extensively, spending weeks compiling data and crafting a comprehensive overview of our department's achievements. The night before the presentation, I stayed late at the office, fine-tuning every slide and rehearsing my talking points. The next morning, I arrived early and set up the projector in the main conference room, arranging the chairs and ensuring everything was perfect. When the regional managers arrived, I was ready. But as I began my presentation, he interrupted me after just 2 slides. "If I may," he said, standing up with a folder in his hand, "I've prepared some additional materials that might be more relevant to today's discussion." What followed was a complete hijacking of my presentation. He had created his own slides, incorporating my data but presenting it from his perspective, with his conclusions and recommendations. The regional managers were impressed, asking detailed questions that he answered with ease. Meanwhile, I sat at the side of the room, watching him receive credit for months of my work. When Peterson introduced him as our rising star and the future of strategic thinking in this department, I felt something die inside me. The final blow came during what should have been a routine check-in meeting. We were sitting in Peterson's office, and I was providing an update on several ongoing projects. The office smelled like the vanilla candle Peterson's assistant always kept burning, and the late afternoon sun was streaming through the windows, creating a deceptively peaceful atmosphere. I was explaining some challenges we were facing with a difficult client when he leaned forward and said, "You know, I've been thinking about this situation, and I believe we need to take a more aggressive approach." The way he said "we" was particularly galling. There was no "we" in his approach. He was positioning himself as the solution to problems I was apparently creating. Peterson nodded thoughtfully as he outlined his strategy, a strategy that involved essentially removing me from client contact and having him serve as the primary liaison. "It's not personal," he added, looking directly at me. "It's just business." The phrase hit me like a physical blow. Everything I'd done for him, all the trust I'd placed in him, all the opportunities I'd created, none of it had been personal for him. It had all been business, a calculated move to advance his own position at my expense. By this point, our interactions had become completely transactional. When he needed information, he would send formal emails instead of walking to my desk. When we passed in the hallway, he would nod politely but distantly, as if we were acquaintances rather than colleagues. The warm conversations over coffee had been replaced by cold efficiency. During team meetings, he would acknowledge my contributions with phrases like, "That's an interesting point," or "we should consider that." But the tone suggested that my input was optional rather than valuable. The person who had once sought my advice on everything from project management to office politics now spoke to me as if I were a junior employee who needed guidance. The reversal was so complete that I began to doubt my own memory of our earlier relationship. Had I imagined the gratitude? Had I misunderstood the respect? The evidence of my own experiences seemed to contradict the reality I was now living, creating a cognitive dissonance that was almost unbearable. The most painful aspect of this transformation was how natural it seemed to everyone else. Colleagues who had worked with me for years accepted his authority without question. When he reassigned tasks or changed procedures, no one asked why someone with barely 2 months of experience was making these decisions. It was as if everyone had collectively agreed to forget that I had been the one to bring him into the organization. The institutional memory of my contributions seemed to evaporate, replaced by a narrative in which he was the natural leader and I was the outdated obstacle to progress. Sitting in my cubicle each morning, listening to him hold court in the break room, I realized that I was witnessing a masterclass in workplace manipulation. He had studied not just how to do my job, but how to make everyone believe he had always been better suited for it than I was. The voice that had once thanked me for believing in him now spoke with the authority of someone who had never needed anyone's help. But what I didn't realize was that this was only the beginning of a systematic campaign to erase me from the workplace I had helped build. The isolation began subtly, like a slow leak that you don't notice until the room is flooded. Our team had always been close-knit, gathering every Friday at Murphy's Bar and Grill down the street from the office for what we called our decompression sessions. These weren't mandatory events, but they were sacred to our group dynamic, a chance to unwind, share frustrations, and strengthen the bonds that made our workplace feel like a second family. I had been one of the founders of this tradition, often picking up the tab and making sure everyone felt included. But 3 months after his arrival, I found myself sitting alone at my usual table, watching through the window as my colleagues laughed and talked at a different restaurant across the street. They had moved the gathering without telling me. When I called Jennifer, our team coordinator and someone I considered a close friend, she sounded genuinely surprised. "Oh, didn't you get the message? We decided to try Applebee's tonight instead. There had been no message, no group text, no casual mention during the day. The exclusion was deliberate, but it was being presented as an oversight. As I sat there with my untouched beer, watching them through the window, I realized that my absence hadn't created a gap, it had created relief. The pattern continued with other social events, each exclusion more pointed than the last. Our department's annual Christmas party had always been a potluck affair, organized by a rotating committee that I had served on multiple times. This year, I volunteered as usual, but was told that the committee was already full. 2 weeks before the party, I discovered that they had been planning it in secret, using a group chat that everyone except me had been added to. The party was held at the community center on Elm Street, the same venue we'd used for the past 3 years. But when I showed up with my traditional green bean casserole, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. Conversations died down as I entered, and people seemed to avoid making eye contact. He was holding court near the punch bowl, regaling a group of colleagues with stories that had them laughing uproariously. When he saw me, he nodded politely and continued his story without missing a beat. The message was clear. This was his crowd now, and I was an unwelcome reminder of a previous era. I stayed for exactly 30 minutes, long enough to be polite, then left my casserole on the food table and slipped out. No one asked where I was going. The exclusion extended to work-related events as well. Our company's quarterly training sessions had always been team efforts, with different people presenting on their areas of expertise. I had been scheduled to present on client relationship management, a topic I'd been developing expertise in for years. 2 days before the training, Peterson's assistant called to inform me that there had been a scheduled change, and my presentation was no longer needed. When I attended the training session, I discovered that he had been given my slot and was presenting on the exact same topic, using many of the same concepts I had discussed with him months earlier. The audience was engaged and responsive, asking thoughtful questions that he answered with impressive confidence. After the session, several people congratulated him on his insights that I recognized as variations of conversations we'd had when he was still learning the ropes. Sitting in the back row of the hotel conference room, listening to my own ideas being presented as his innovations, I felt a profound sense of displacement. It was as if I was watching someone else live my professional life, wearing my experiences like a borrowed suit that somehow fit them better. The most painful exclusion happened during our team-building retreat at Pine Lake Lodge, an annual tradition that combined professional development with outdoor activities. I had attended every retreat for the past 6 years and had even helped plan several of them. This year, however, there seemed to be confusion about my participation. When I asked Jennifer about the details, she mentioned that the group was keeping it small this year, and that not everyone would be able to attend. I assumed this meant budget constraints were limiting participation, so I didn't press the issue. It wasn't until I saw the social media posts that I realized the truth. Everyone from our department had attended except me. The photos showed my colleagues participating in trust exercises, sharing meals, and engaging in the kinds of bonding activities that had always been central to our team culture. He was prominently featured in many of the photos, often positioned at the center of group shots as if he had always been the natural leader. Comments on the posts praised the team's unity and vision for the future. Seeing those images felt like being shown evidence of my own irrelevance, proof that the team functioned better without me. The workplace became a minefield of awkward encounters and stilted conversations. Colleagues who had once confided in me about their personal lives now treated me with polite distance. The easy camaraderie that had characterized our daily interactions was replaced by formal courtesy. When I joined conversations in the break room, they would naturally wind down, people finding reasons to return to their desks. The shift was so gradual that no single incident could be called hostile or unprofessional, but the cumulative effect was devastating. I began to feel like a ghost haunting my own workplace, visible but not truly seen, present but not truly included. The worst part was how everyone seemed to participate in this exclusion while simultaneously denying it was happening. When I mentioned feeling left out to Margaret from accounting, someone I'd known for 5 years. She looked genuinely confused and assured me that it was all in my head. "You're such an important part of this team," she said, but her words felt hollow, disconnected from the reality I was experiencing daily. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine staff meeting. We were discussing the allocation of project responsibilities for the upcoming quarter, and I was expecting to be assigned several initiatives I'd been developing. Instead, Peterson announced that they were restructuring the workflow to maximize efficiency and leverage our newest talent. Every project I'd been working on was reassigned to him, with explanations that emphasized his fresh perspective and strategic thinking. The other team members nodded approvingly, as if this reorganization made perfect sense. When I asked about my role in these projects, Peterson smiled condescendingly and said I would be supporting the new structure in an advisory capacity. The room fell silent and I could feel everyone's discomfort, but no one spoke up. The person sitting next to me, someone I'd mentored and supported through her first year with the company, stared at her notes and said nothing. In that moment, I realized that my isolation wasn't just social, it was professional. I wasn't just being excluded from lunches and parties. I was being systematically removed from the work that had defined my identity for nearly a decade. The silence of my colleagues was perhaps more devastating than the betrayal itself. These were people I'd worked alongside for years, people I'd helped through difficult projects and personal crises, people who had benefited from my knowledge and support. Yet when I needed them to acknowledge what was happening, they all seemed to develop a collective case of amnesia. It was as if they had made a group decision to pretend that the gradual erasure of my contributions was natural and inevitable. The few times I tried to address the situation directly, I was met with platitudes about team evolution and natural leadership transitions. No one wanted to admit that they were participating in something cruel and unjust. Instead, they took refuge in corporate speak and professional euphemisms that allowed them to avoid confronting the moral dimensions of what they were enabling. Standing in the parking lot after that final meeting, watching my colleagues file out to their cars without a backward glance, I understood that the betrayal wasn't just personal, it was systemic. But there was still one more devastating revelation waiting for me, one that would force me to confront the true cost of my misplaced trust. The email arrived on a Wednesday at exactly 4:47 p.m., just as I was preparing to leave for the day. The subject line read simply, "Meeting tomorrow, HR." There was no context, no explanation, just those 4 clinical words that somehow managed to convey both urgency and inevitability. The sender was Linda from Human Resources, someone I'd exchanged pleasantries with for years, but had never had a formal meeting with. As I sat in my car in the employee parking lot behind our building, reading the message on my phone, I felt my stomach drop. The timing was suspicious, late enough in the day that I couldn't seek clarification, early enough in the week that I'd have to endure a sleepless night wondering what it meant. I tried calling Linda's extension, but it went straight to voicemail. Her outgoing message was cheerful and professional, promising to return calls within 24 hours. The normalcy of her tone contrasted sharply with the growing dread in my chest. I drove home that evening in a fog, mechanically stopping at red lights and taking familiar turns while my mind raced through possibilities. Deep down, I knew what this meeting would bring, but part of me still hoped I was wrong. The night was endless. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic on the interstate. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the events of the past few months, looking for signs I might have missed, strategies I could have employed differently. The irony wasn't lost on me that the person I'd helped bring into the organization was likely sleeping peacefully, while I agonized over my professional future. I got up twice to check my email, hoping for some clarification or additional context, but there was nothing. Around 3 a.m., I found myself in the kitchen, making a cup of tea I didn't want, just to have something to do with my hands. The house felt unnaturally quiet, as if it too was holding its breath. I thought about the years I'd dedicated to the company, the relationships I'd built, the expertise I'd developed. All of it seemed fragile now, contingent on the whims of people who had apparently decided I was no longer valuable. By the time dawn broke through my bedroom windows, I had rehearsed a dozen different scenarios for the meeting, none of them ending well. The next morning, I arrived at the office 30 minutes early, hoping to catch Linda before our scheduled 9 a.m. meeting. The building felt different somehow, as if I was seeing it through new eyes. The familiar lobby with its generic corporate art and perpetually broken coffee machine looked like a waiting room in a doctor's office where you go to receive bad news. Linda's office was on the second floor, in a section of the building I rarely visited. The hallway smelled like fresh carpet and industrial air freshener, and the fluorescent lights hummed with an intensity that made everything feel harsh and overexposed. When I knocked on her door at exactly 9 a.m., she called for me to enter with a voice that was carefully neutral. She was sitting behind her desk with a manila folder in front of her, and Peterson was seated in one of the two chairs facing her desk. He didn't look up when I entered, instead studying a document in his lap with apparent fascination. The setup was clearly designed to minimize eye contact and personal connection. Linda gestured to the empty chair beside Peterson, and I sat down, noting how the chairs were positioned to face her rather than each other. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in corporate euphemism and emotional detachment. Linda opened the folder and began reading from what was obviously a prepared script. "We appreciate your years of service to the company," she began, her voice maintaining that carefully modulated tone that HR professionals must practice in training seminars. "However, we've made the decision to restructure your position as part of our ongoing organizational evolution." The words were carefully chosen to sound like a business decision rather than a personal judgment, but the effect was the same. She explained that my role was being eliminated due to strategic realignment of departmental priorities. When I asked for specifics about what this meant, Peterson finally looked up from his document. "It's nothing personal," he said, echoing the phrase that had been used to dismiss my concerns for months. "The company is moving in a new direction, and we need different skill sets for the challenges ahead." The clinical precision with which he delivered this explanation was remarkable. There was no acknowledgement of my contributions, no recognition of the relationships I'd built, no admission that the person sitting next to me owed his presence in that room to my recommendation. The logistics of my departure were handled with the same cold efficiency. Linda explained that my last day would be Friday, giving me exactly 2 days to transition my responsibilities and complete any outstanding projects. The timeline was clearly designed to minimize disruption to the organization, rather than to accommodate my needs. When I asked about the projects I've been developing, Peterson intervened to explain that those would be reassigned to ensure continuity. The irony was staggering. The person who had systematically undermined my position was now being trusted to continue my work. Linda handed me a packet of information about COBRA benefits and unemployment procedures, speaking in the same tone she might use to explain the office parking policy. The bureaucratic nature of the process was almost surreal. Years of professional relationships and accumulated expertise were being reduced to a series of forms and procedures. When I asked if there was any possibility of reconsideration, Linda shook her head sympathetically and said the decision was final and non-negotiable. The meeting that had shaped my professional future lasted exactly 18 minutes. Walking back to my desk after the meeting felt like moving through a dream. The office buzzed with its usual morning energy. People grabbing coffee, checking emails, chatting about their evening plans. No one seemed to notice that I had just received my professional death sentence, and I realized that this was by design. The meeting had been scheduled and conducted in a way that minimized visible disruption. My colleagues would learn of my departure through carefully worded internal communications that emphasized exciting new opportunities and strategic growth initiatives. There would be no dramatic scene, no emotional goodbye, no acknowledgement of what had actually transpired. I sat at my desk and stared at the computer screen, wondering how to begin the process of dismantling a professional life I'd spent years building. The personal items scattered around my workspace, photos, plants, coffee mugs, suddenly looked like artifacts from someone else's life. In the cubicle across from mine, I could hear him on a phone call, discussing project timelines with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the organization. His voice carried no trace of the gratitude or humility that had characterized our early interactions. The final indignity came when I realized that he wouldn't even acknowledge my departure. Throughout those last 2 days, as I packed my belongings and transferred files, he maintained a careful distance. There was no offer to help with the transition, no expression of gratitude for the opportunity I'd provided, no recognition of the mentorship I'd offered. When our paths crossed in the hallway, he would nod politely, as if we were distant acquaintances rather than two people whose professional lives had become intimately intertwined. On my last day, as I loaded the last box into my car, I saw him through the office window, sitting in what had been my chair in the conference room, leading a meeting with the easy authority of someone who had always belonged there. The transformation was complete. The grateful protege had become the confident leader, and I had become an inconvenient memory to be erased. As I drove out of the parking lot for the last time, I understood that the betrayal wasn't just about losing a job. It was about having my professional identity systematically dismantled by someone I had trusted completely. That even in that moment of devastating loss, I couldn't have imagined how profoundly my absence would be ignored by the people I had considered friends and colleagues. The first Monday morning without a job was the hardest. I woke up at 6:30 a.m., just as I had for the past 7 years, and for a moment forgot that I had nowhere to go. The muscle memory of routine was so strong that I actually started getting dressed before reality hit me. I sat on the edge of my bed, still wearing one sock, and felt the weight of emptiness settle around me like a heavy blanket. The silence in my apartment was deafening. No alarm clock urgency, number morning news in the background, no mental checklist of meetings and deadlines. I made coffee out of habit and sat at my kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from me, where I used to spread out work papers while eating breakfast. The morning light streaming through the windows felt different, softer somehow, as if it knew I had nowhere urgent to be. I checked my phone compulsively, expecting emails or text messages that never came. The professional relationships I thought were friendships had apparently been as disposable as my position. The corporate world I'd devoted nearly a decade of my life to had moved on without missing a beat, and I was left to face the devastating realization that my absence created no void at all. 2 weeks passed before I received my first and only message from a former colleague. It was from Jennifer, sent on a Saturday evening when she was probably feeling guilty about her silence. "Hey, hope you're doing well. Miss seeing you around the office. Let's grab coffee soon." The casual tone and exclamation points felt forced, like someone trying too hard to sound normal about an abnormal situation. I stared at the message for 20 minutes before responding with an equally artificial "would love to. Let me know when you're free." But the coffee date never materialized. She responded with vague promises about checking her schedule and getting back to me soon. But weeks turned into months without follow-up. The silence that followed was more honest than her initial outreach. It confirmed what I had suspected but hadn't wanted to admit. The relationships I'd valued were contingent on proximity and professional utility. Without the shared context of work, without my ability to be useful to their careers, there was no foundation for genuine connection. The betrayal wasn't just professional, it was personal, revealing that the friendships I believed in were as superficial as the company's stated values about loyalty and teamwork. The hardest part was driving past the office building on my way to job interviews. The first time it happened, I was heading to a meeting at a recruiting firm downtown, and my usual route took me right past the parking lot where I'd spent so many mornings and evenings. I slowed down involuntarily, scanning the familiar cars and looking for signs of the life I'd been exiled from. The building looked exactly the same. Same brick facade, same glass entrance, same corporate logo that had once made me feel proud to be associated with it. But now it felt like looking at a house where strangers lived, a place that held my memories but no longer held space for me. I could see people moving around inside, their shadows passing behind the windows, and I wondered if anyone ever mentioned my name, or if I'd been erased so completely that it was as if I'd never existed. The thought that my years of contribution could be so easily forgotten was almost unbearable. I took a different route after that, adding 15 minutes to my commute rather than subject myself to the daily reminder of my disposability. 3 months after my termination, I ran into Margaret from accounting at the grocery store on Riverside Drive. I was in the produce section, mindlessly squeezing avocados and trying to decide if I could afford the organic ones, when I heard her voice behind me. "Oh my God, hi. How are you doing?" Her surprise seemed genuine, but there was something uncomfortable in her expression, as if she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. We made small talk while standing between the bananas and the apples, and I asked about people we'd worked with together. Her answers were vague and evasive, filled with corporate speak about transitions and new directions. When I asked specifically about him, her face brightened considerably. "He's doing amazing. Really stepped up and taken on so much responsibility. Peterson is really impressed with his strategic thinking." The enthusiasm in her voice when talking about his success contrasted sharply with the awkwardness she'd shown when greeting me. As we parted ways in the parking lot, she promised to stay in touch, but we both knew she wouldn't. The encounter left me feeling hollow, like a ghost haunting my own past life, invisible to everyone except when I made the mistake of manifesting in public spaces. The depth of my erasure became clear when I discovered through LinkedIn that the company had won an industry award for a project I'd initiated and developed. The press release featured a photo of the team celebrating, with him prominently positioned in the center, holding the award and smiling broadly. The project description credited innovative leadership and strategic vision, without mentioning that the foundational work had been done months before his arrival. Comments on the company's post praised the team's dedication and Peterson's excellent management, with several clients and industry contacts offering congratulations. I scrolled through dozens of responses, looking for any acknowledgement of my contribution, but found none. It was as if the project had sprung fully formed from his strategic brilliance, with no connection to the months of research, planning, and relationship building that had made it possible. The most painful part wasn't just the lack of credit. It was the realization that everyone involved knew the truth, that had collectively agreed to participate in rewriting history. My contributions hadn't just been forgotten. They'd been actively erased and reassigned to create a more convenient narrative. 6 months later, I learned from a mutual acquaintance that he had been promoted to a senior management position. The news came casually, mentioned in passing during a conversation about something else entirely. "Yeah, that guy who replaced you really hit the ground running," she said, not realizing the impact of her words. "He's already been promoted twice. Peterson thinks he's going places." The speed of his advancement was remarkable, but not surprising. He had understood something about organizational politics that I'd been too naive to grasp. Loyalty flows upward, and competence is less important than the ability to make your superiors look good. While I'd focused on doing excellent work and building genuine relationships with colleagues, he'd concentrated on positioning himself as indispensable to the people who controlled his future. The promotion was validation of his strategy and confirmation of my irrelevance. The company that had once valued my dedication and expertise now rewarded someone who had systematically undermined and replaced me. The injustice was staggering, but it was also educational in the most brutal way possible. The final confirmation of my complete erasure came almost a year later, when I received an invitation to the company's annual holiday party. It was clearly a mistake, some automated system that hadn't been updated to remove my name from the mailing list. But seeing that invitation, with its cheerful graphics and promises of celebration, brought back a flood of memories from parties past. I remembered organizing committees, contributing to potluck dinners, and staying late to help clean up, because I felt genuine investment in the company's culture. Now I was receiving an invitation to celebrate an organization that had discarded me without ceremony or acknowledgement. I didn't attend, obviously, but I couldn't help imagining him at the party, surrounded by colleagues who had witnessed my departure, and chosen to embrace his version of events. The invitation was a small thing, but it represented something larger: the complete disconnect between the company's stated values about family and loyalty and the reality of how they treated people who had devoted years of their lives to building something they believed in. But even as I processed this final insult, I was beginning to understand that the real revelation wasn't about their failure to remember me. It was about what this experience had taught me about trust, loyalty, and the price of naivety in professional relationships. The lessons carved themselves into my consciousness with the precision of scars, each one bought with pain but paid for with wisdom. Sitting in my apartment on a quiet Sunday morning, 18 months after my professional world had collapsed, I finally understood that the betrayal had been a brutal education in human nature and workplace dynamics. The person I'd trusted had taught me more about organizational politics in 3 months than I'd learned in 7 years of dedicated service. As I sipped coffee from a mug that no longer carried the company logo, I realized that my naivety had been both my weakness and my strength. It had made me vulnerable to manipulation, but it had also allowed me to maintain genuine relationships and contribute authentically to my work. The challenge now was to retain my capacity for trust, while developing the discernment to recognize when that trust was being exploited. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me that the person who had destroyed my career had also forced me to develop the very skills that might have prevented his betrayal in the first place. But transformation requires destruction, and sometimes the most valuable lessons come wrapped in the most painful experiences. I will never again mistake professional courtesy for personal loyalty. The distinction seems obvious now, but at the time I confused his respectful demeanor and grateful words with genuine appreciation and commitment. He had mastered the art of saying what people wanted to hear while privately pursuing his own agenda. His compliments were strategic, his gratitude was tactical, and his respect was purely transactional. I had interpreted his behavior through the lens of my own values, assuming that his words reflected the same depth of feeling and commitment that mine did. The reality was that he was performing a role, playing the part of the grateful protégé while systematically studying how to replace me. Real loyalty isn't demonstrated through words or gestures. It's revealed through actions during moments of testing. When he had the opportunity to defend me or acknowledge my contributions, he chose instead to align himself with power and advance his own position. True character isn't shown when it's convenient or advantageous. It's revealed when there's a cost to doing the right thing. The next time someone seeks my mentorship or support, I'll watch how they treat others when they think no one important is looking. I will never again open doors for people without first understanding who they are when nobody's watching. The person he presented during our initial interactions was carefully crafted to appeal to my values and trigger my protective instincts. He spoke about loyalty, teamwork, and gratitude because he had identified these as important to me, not because they were important to him. His vulnerability was calculated, his humility was strategic, and his appreciation was designed to lower my defenses. I had made the classic mistake of judging him by his words rather than his actions, by his stated intentions rather than his demonstrated behavior. The truth about someone's character isn't found in their resume or their interview responses. It's revealed in how they treat service workers, how they speak about former employers, and how they react when they think they're not being evaluated. Going forward, I'll pay attention to the subtle indicators that reveal authentic character. Do they remember details about other people's lives? Do they follow through on small commitments? Do they take responsibility for mistakes without deflecting blame? These seemingly minor behaviors are much more predictive than grand gestures or impressive credentials. I will never again assume that competence and dedication are sufficient for professional security. I had operated under the naive assumption that good work would speak for itself, that consistent performance and reliable results would create job security and career advancement. I believed that by focusing on excellence and building genuine relationships with colleagues, I would naturally earn respect and protection within the organization. This worldview was both admirable and dangerously incomplete. While competence is necessary, It's not sufficient in environments where politics and perception matter more than performance. He understood that advancement required not just doing good work, but ensuring that the right people noticed and valued that work. He invested time in understanding what motivated our superiors, what metrics they used to evaluate success, and what narrative would position him as indispensable. Meanwhile, I was focused on the work itself, assuming that quality would be recognized and rewarded. The lesson isn't to abandon excellence, but to complement it with strategic awareness of how decisions are made, and influence is exercised within organizational structures. I will never again remain silent when I see injustice or feel threatened professionally. My response to the mounting signs of betrayal was to hope that things would improve, to give people the benefit of the doubt, and to avoid confrontation that might make the situation worse. This passive approach allowed the narrative about my dispensability to solidify without challenge. When colleagues excluded me from meetings or decisions, I rationalized their behavior rather than addressing it directly. When he began positioning himself as my replacement, I waited for someone else to notice and intervene rather than advocating for myself. The cost of avoiding conflict was the loss of my career, but the deeper cost was the realization that my silence had been interpreted as acceptance. Organizations don't protect people who won't protect themselves, and colleagues don't defend those who won't defend their own contributions. Speaking up doesn't guarantee a different outcome, but silence guarantees that your perspective won't be heard. The next time I sense systematic undermining or professional threat, I'll document everything, build alliances with people who have influence, and force conversations that clarify expectations and accountabilities. I will never again trust that loyalty flows both ways in professional relationships. I had assumed that the investment I made in his success would create reciprocal loyalty, that the doors I opened for him would generate gratitude that would protect me when I needed support. This assumption was based on my own values rather than on evidence of his character. The reality of organizational life is that loyalty is often a luxury that people abandon when it conflicts with their advancement. He owed his position to my recommendation, but he also understood that his future depended on distancing himself from that debt and establishing independent credibility with leadership. My expectation of gratitude was not just naive. It was professionally dangerous because it prevented me from recognizing the threat he represented. Going forward, I'll maintain supportive professional relationships, while understanding that everyone is ultimately responsible for their own career security. I can be helpful and generous without creating dependencies or expectations that make me vulnerable to betrayal. True professional relationships are built on mutual respect and shared values, not on debt and obligation. The most important lesson is that some experiences, no matter how painful, are necessary for growth. The betrayal forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about workplace dynamics, human nature, and my own blind spots. It shattered illusions that had made me vulnerable, but also naive about the realities of organizational life. The person I was before this experience was kind but gullible, generous but unprotected, loyal but unprepared for disloyalty. The person I've become retains those positive qualities, while adding layers of discernment and strategic awareness that make me more effective and less vulnerable. I wouldn't choose to repeat this experience, but I can acknowledge that it taught me things I couldn't have learned any other way. The pain was real, but so was the education. The loss was devastating, but the wisdom gained was invaluable. Sometimes the universe delivers exactly the lesson you need in the form you least expect. The betrayal wasn't just about losing a job. It was about gaining the knowledge and resilience necessary to navigate a complex world with both integrity and intelligence. But perhaps the most profound realization was yet to come, understanding that this experience hadn't diminished my capacity for trust, but had refined my ability to place that trust wisely.